Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most misunderstood chapters of medieval life, the chaotic, hilarious, and surprisingly familiar world of medieval teenagers. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine waking up in a medieval village at about 14 years old. Yesterday, everyone still called you just a child, whenever you did something foolish. Today, your father is wondering why you haven't already chopped enough firewood to survive the winter. Your mother has a list of chores long enough to qualify as a religious pilgrimage, and your neighbours have started asking when you're going to become a useful member of society. Good morning. Childhood has officially been cancelled. The funny thing is that the Middle Ages didn't really have the idea of a teenager. There wasn't a magical period where adults accepted that you were still figuring yourself out. There was no, "Don't worry, they're only 14. Instead, it was more like, "You're 14. Excellent. Here's an axe. Try not to lose a foot." Needless to say, this system produced interesting results. Depending on where you were born, you might already be leaving home to become an apprentice. One day you're sleeping in your parents' cottage. The next you're living with a blacksmith, baker, carpenter, or tailor who has promised to teach you a valuable trade. He has also promised to shout at you whenever you make a mistake, which, fortunately for him, you'll do several times before breakfast. If you stayed on the family farm, things weren't much gentler. Your alarm clock was a rooster with anger issues. Your daily schedule included feeding animals much larger than yourself, hauling buckets heavy enough to make modern gym memberships seem unnecessary, and working from sunrise until sunset. Somewhere in between, you were expected to develop excellent character. Apparently, exhaustion was considered an educational tool. If you were born into a noble family, don't get too comfortable. Instead of mucking out pigsties, you were expected to master riding, hunting, swordsmanship, etiquette, and enough table manners to avoid embarrassing your family in front of other nobles. You still had adults criticizing everything you did. They simply did it while wearing nicer clothes. Girls faced the same sudden leap into responsibility. You learned spinning, weaving, cooking, brewing, gardening, caring for younger siblings, and managing a household before you'd even finished growing. Noble girls studied music, embroidery, reading, household management, and courtly manners. In either case, everyone seemed convinced that adulthood could be learned by assigning you more work. History suggests otherwise, because despite the endless responsibilities, you were still, inconveniently, a teenager. Your brain wasn't thinking, "I should spend this beautiful spring afternoon improving my economic productivity." It was thinking, "I wonder if my friends are doing something incredibly stupid without me." And they probably were. This is where medieval records become unexpectedly entertaining. Town officials complained constantly about groups of young people making too much noise after dark. Priests grumbled that they giggled during sermons. Guild masters accused apprentices of disappearing when there was work to do, only to mysteriously reappear when dinner was served. Parents wondered why perfectly intelligent children suddenly lost the ability to make sensible decisions whenever three friends were standing nearby. Some mysteries truly are timeless. Older generations also complained that young people cared too much about fashion, spent too much time flirting, stayed out too late, talked back, ignored advice, and believed they knew everything despite having accomplished very little. If that sounds familiar, congratulations. You've discovered one of history's oldest traditions. The hairstyles were different. The shoes were pointier. The questionable decisions simply involved more livestock and fewer smartphones. In fact, if you dropped into a medieval village wearing modern clothes, you'd probably recognize the teenagers immediately. Not because of what they wore, but because one of them would almost certainly be attempting a dangerous idea that began with the words, "Watch this." And that's exactly what makes medieval teenagers so fascinating. Beneath the chainmail, wool tunics, church bells, and muddy roads were young people who laughed too loudly, fell in love too quickly, underestimated consequences with breathtaking confidence, and possessed the remarkable ability to convince every adult around them that the next generation was clearly doomed. As you'll soon discover, they were absolute professionals at it. If you think teenagers invented dressing specifically to annoy their parents, medieval history has some excellent news for you. The year is somewhere around 1350. You've finally earned a little money as an apprentice, or perhaps your parents reluctantly bought you a new outfit after months of complaints. Naturally, your first thought isn't, "I'll purchase something practical." No, your first thought is, "How can I make every respectable adult in town sigh loudly?" Welcome to medieval fashion. Contrary to popular belief, people in the Middle Ages didn't all wander around wearing identical brown sacks. Teenagers especially loved standing out. Bright reds, greens, blues, striped fabrics, flashy belts, colourful hose, fancy hats, embroidered sleeves, and shoes with ridiculously long pointed toes became the medieval equivalent of telling the world, "I'm cooler than everyone else." Adults absolutely hated it. Town councils across Europe repeatedly passed laws trying to limit what young people could wear. Not because colourful clothes were dangerous, but because teenagers kept dressing above their social status. Apparently nothing ruined society faster than an apprentice looking slightly too fashionable. Imagine your mayor holding an emergency meeting because Kevin the blacksmith's apprentice bought an expensive belt. Civilization was clearly hanging by a thread. Shoes became one of the biggest battlegrounds. The fashionable style featured long pointed tips, known today as poulaines, that sometimes stretched several inches beyond the actual foot. Walking in them was already awkward enough. Working in them made even less sense. But practicality has never been the strongest influence on teenage fashion. Some wealthy young nobles wore points so long they had to tie them to their legs with little cords just to avoid tripping over themselves. If you've ever watched someone sacrifice comfort entirely because something looked cool, congratulations. You already understand medieval fashion. Hair caused just as much outrage. Older generations complained constantly that young men spent too much time styling their hair instead of working. They curled it, trimmed it into fashionable shapes, and occasionally wore it much longer than conservative adults considered respectable. Priests wrote sermons criticizing vanity, while fathers wondered why their sons owned combs but mysteriously couldn't remember where they had left the shovel. Girls experimented too. Braided hairstyles became increasingly elaborate. Ribbons appeared everywhere, and fashionable headwear changed almost as quickly as gossip spread through the marketplace. The complaints sound almost identical to modern ones. Why are your trousers so tight? Why are your shoes shaped like that? Why spend money on clothes when you already have perfectly good ones? 800 years later, parents are still asking exactly the same questions. The more things changed, the pointier the shoes became. And for medieval teenagers, that was probably reason enough to wear them. If medieval teenagers had social media, one group would almost certainly have filled their pages with gloomy poetry, dramatic sunset drawings, and captions like, "Nobody understands me." Except they wouldn't have posted it online. They would have written it on expensive parchment, sighed heavily beside a castle window, and recited it to anyone unfortunate enough to make eye contact. Believe it or not, the Middle Ages had their own version of emotionally dramatic teenagers. If you belonged to a noble family, there was a good chance you'd become obsessed with the fashionable idea of courtly love. According to poets, true love wasn't supposed to be simple or happy. That would be far too convenient. Real romance meant longing endlessly for someone you probably couldn't marry, writing poems about your suffering, and staring thoughtfully into the distance whenever possible. You were expected to be miserable with style. The more impossible your love was, the more respectable your heartbreak became. Imagine spending 3 months composing a beautiful poem because someone smiled at you once during a feast. Then discovering they were already promised to another noble. Then writing 4 more poems about how devastating this was. Modern teenagers call it being left on red. Medieval teenagers called it literature. Young nobles adored romantic songs performed by wandering minstrels. These songs spoke of impossible devotion, endless waiting, sleepless nights, and lovers separated by duty or family honour. After listening to enough of them, it became surprisingly easy to convince yourself that your own life was a tragic masterpiece, even if your greatest hardship that week had been losing a falconry competition. Adults, naturally, found all of this rather exhausting. Parents wanted heirs, political alliances, and respectable marriages. Teenagers wanted destiny. The two rarely agreed. Even outside noble society, young people experienced heartbreak just as intensely. Village dances, church festivals, and market fairs gave boys and girls opportunities to meet, flirt, and occasionally embarrass themselves in spectacular fashion. A rejected invitation to dance could feel like the end of the world, despite the inconvenient fact that tomorrow everyone still had to milk cows together. You couldn't exactly transfer schools. Monks also complained about young people becoming distracted by romance instead of focusing on work or religion. It's almost comforting that even 8 centuries ago, adults believed teenagers spent entirely too much time thinking about each other. Some habits simply refused to go extinct. Of course, not every quiet teenager was secretly composing heartbreaking poetry. Sometimes you simply wandered into the woods because it was one of the few places where nobody expected you to carry water, stack firewood, clean tools, feed chickens, or explain why your friend had somehow fallen into the mill pond again. Solitude was cheaper than therapy. So, while medieval teenagers never dyed their hair black or listened to sad playlists, they absolutely understood dramatic emotions, impossible crushes, and the overwhelming certainty that nobody in history had ever suffered quite as much as they had. History, as always, politely disagrees. If medieval villages had teenagers, medieval cities had apprentices. And if villages occasionally complained about young people causing trouble, cities practically budgeted for it. At first glance, becoming an apprentice sounded wonderfully respectable. Around the age of 13 or 14, you left your family and moved into the home of a master craftsman. Perhaps you would become a blacksmith, a baker, a cooper, a mason, or a tailor. Over the next several years, you would learn a valuable trade, eventually earn your freedom, and hopefully make a decent living. That was the official version. The unofficial version involved a house full of teenagers living together, working long hours, possessing more energy than common sense, and having almost no private supervision once the workday ended. You can probably guess what happened next. Apprentices worked from sunrise until dusk, often 6 days a week. They swept workshops, carried supplies, cleaned tools, pumped bellows, fetched water, and performed every unpleasant task their master could think of before they were trusted with real craftsmanship. By evening, they were tired. Unfortunately, tired did not mean sensible. As soon as work ended, groups of apprentices poured into the streets looking for entertainment. Sometimes that meant friendly games. Sometimes it meant wrestling. Sometimes it meant singing loudly through narrow streets long after respectable people had gone to bed. And sometimes it meant discovering that the apprentices from the neighbouring workshop had been making jokes about your trade. Clearly, diplomacy was no longer an option. Cities across Europe recorded countless fights between rival groups of apprentices. Bakers argued with butchers, weavers insulted fullers, shoemakers clashed with tailors. Historians aren't always certain what started these disputes. It was often something incredibly important, like an insult, or a hat, or someone looking at someone else for slightly too long. The exact reason usually disappeared from the records. The bruises did not. Guild masters constantly complained that apprentices disappeared when work needed doing, yet somehow reappeared the moment food was served. It's an extraordinary coincidence that has survived into the modern workplace. Many apprentices also developed reputations for sneaking into taverns whenever they could. Officially, they were there to enjoy a mug of ale after a hard day's work. Unofficially, they were there because every other apprentice was there. Peer pressure did not wait for the invention of high school. Curfews attempted to solve the problem. Many towns required young people to return home after the evening bell. Patrols walked the streets looking for anyone still wandering about. This worked almost as well as telling teenagers not to do something because it's dangerous. Being caught outside after curfew could lead to fines, punishment from your master, or an uncomfortable conversation involving disappointed adults using phrases like, "I'm not angry," which, even in the Middle Ages, was usually much worse. Despite all the complaints, apprentices were the future of every medieval city. They would become the craftsmen who built houses, forged swords, baked bread, and kept towns alive. But first, they had to survive the remarkably difficult challenge of being 16. History suggests that was often the harder job. If you ever find yourself thinking, "My parents just don't understand me," medieval history has some comforting news. Neither did yours. The average medieval household wasn't exactly built for privacy. Entire families often lived, ate, worked, argued, and slept in the same building. If you wanted a dramatic exit after an argument, your options were fairly limited. You could storm outside, and then probably run into your uncle feeding the pigs. Escaping emotionally was difficult when everyone knew exactly where you had gone. Parents depended on their children. This wasn't just about teaching responsibility. A farm needed every pair of hands it could get. A workshop relied on apprentices. Every chore left unfinished usually became someone else's problem, and that someone was often your father. Which explains why medieval parents developed a remarkable ability to become irritated before breakfast. Have you fed the chickens? Yes. The hungry chickens disagree. The arguments themselves would sound surprisingly familiar today. Parents insisted you were wasting time. You insisted you were just about to do it. Parents wanted you to focus on work. You wanted to see your friends. Parents believed you spent entirely too much time thinking about boys or girls. You believed they were ruining your life. Human civilization, it turns out, has been running this script for centuries. One major difference was that medieval parents had much bigger decisions to make on your behalf. By your mid-teens, conversations about your future became unavoidable. If you were a boy, would you stay on the farm, learn a trade, join a noble household, perhaps even fight in a lord's army someday? If you were a girl, discussions about marriage could begin surprisingly early. Families often thought about practical matters first: land, alliances, financial security, and reputation. Meanwhile, you were probably wondering whether the person you liked might also be attending the next village festival. Priorities rarely aligned. Teenagers also had an unfortunate habit of believing they knew better than adults who had somehow survived 40 years without their advice. Parents would explain why something was a terrible idea. You would confidently ignore them. Several hours later, you would accidentally prove them correct. This educational method remains remarkably popular. Church officials frequently preached that young people should obey their parents without complaint. The fact that they repeated this message so often suggests the audience wasn't listening particularly carefully. Medieval sermons are full of warnings against stubborn youth, disrespectful children, and sons who answered back. Apparently, eye-rolling existed long before mirrors became affordable. Not every household was filled with constant arguments, of course. Many families were close, working side by side every day, and relying on one another to survive difficult harvests, harsh winters, and unexpected illness. But affection didn't eliminate frustration. Imagine spending 12 straight hours together every single day. No television, no headphones, no separate bedrooms, no convenient excuse about your phone battery dying. Just endless proximity. By the end of harvest season, even the saints might have considered taking a very long walk. Yet despite the disagreements, parents understood something teenagers often didn't. Childhood was ending quickly. The carefree years were disappearing, replaced by responsibilities that would last a lifetime. Adults worried because they knew how hard the future could be. Teenagers, meanwhile, were busy arguing about whether they could stay out just a little longer. Some conversations, it seems, never go out of fashion. If you think teenagers only started inventing terrible ideas after electricity was discovered, medieval history would like a brief word. You and your friends have finally escaped work for the evening. Nobody wants to think about apprenticeships, chores, or tomorrow's endless list of responsibilities. Naturally, someone says the four most dangerous words in any language: I have an idea. No good story has ever started there. Medieval records are filled with complaints about young people pulling pranks that ranged from mildly amusing to, "Please explain this to the town magistrate." One favourite target was livestock, not because anyone disliked the animals, but because moving a pig, goat, or donkey into the wrong place created absolute chaos. Imagine opening your workshop in the morning to discover 3 confused sheep calmly inspecting your expensive tools. The sheep were innocent. Your friends definitely weren't. Then there were the carts. A group of bored teenagers could quietly move someone's cart during the night and leave the owner searching half the village the next morning. It wasn't exactly grand larceny. It was simply being spectacularly annoying. Church bells were another irresistible temptation. These bells weren't just decorative. They announced fires, funerals, emergencies, religious services, and important town meetings. Ringing one at the wrong time sent people running into the streets expecting disaster. Instead, they found 6 teenagers trying very hard not to laugh. Oddly enough, priests failed to appreciate the joke. Some young people thought it would be hilarious to knock on doors late at night before disappearing into the darkness. Others threw mud, fruit, or handfuls of straw at their friends during festivals, usually starting chain reactions that involved dozens of people who had absolutely nothing to do with the original prank. History rarely remembers who threw the first apple. It remembers the brawl that followed. Festivals made everything worse. Large crowds, music, dancing, ale, and very little supervision created conditions that every teenager interpreted as unlimited opportunity. Someone climbed a roof. Someone else climbed after him because apparently bad ideas become better when they're shared. Soon half the square was watching adults attempt to convince 2 laughing teenagers that rooftops were not intended for recreational purposes. The adults were unsuccessful. Even monasteries weren't completely safe. Monks occasionally complained about local youth sneaking near monastery grounds simply to make noise, shout jokes, or interrupt the peaceful silence. Imagine dedicating your life to quiet contemplation only to hear someone outside imitating a chicken for reasons known only to teenagers. Faith is tested in many ways. Sometimes it wears muddy boots. Of course, not every prank stayed harmless. A joke involving fire could quickly become terrifying in towns built largely from wood and thatch. A prank involving frightened horses could injure people. What began as laughter sometimes ended with angry neighbours, damaged property, and an appearance before local officials. Which raises an important question. Did punishment stop teenagers from trying again? Absolutely not. If anything, medieval adults spent centuries writing new rules because every generation of young people discovered entirely new ways to ignore the old ones. Some traditions are simply impossible to outlaw. If you imagine medieval teenagers quietly heading home after work with a wholesome desire to reflect on the day's lessons, you have clearly never met a group of teenage boys with absolutely nothing scheduled for the evening. Once the work was finished and the masters stopped watching, you and your friends naturally gathered together. At first, it was innocent enough. You talked about work, complained about your parents, laughed about someone's embarrassing mistake, and argued over who was strongest. Then someone from the next street walked past. Unfortunately, he looked slightly too confident. Across medieval Europe, towns often developed fierce neighbourhood rivalries. Teenagers living on one street formed close groups with the boys they had grown up beside. Those from another district did exactly the same. Nobody officially declared war. It simply happened. One insult led to another. One shove became 3. Suddenly, 30 young men were charging at each other with the enthusiasm of people who had completely forgotten how much tomorrow's bruises were going to hurt. Town records are full of complaints about these fights. Sometimes they broke out during festivals, sometimes after church, sometimes on ordinary afternoons because apparently Tuesday seemed like an excellent day for public violence. The reasons were often spectacularly unimpressive. Someone bumped into someone borrowed something and forgot to return it. Someone called someone else's friend an idiot. To be fair, medieval insults were apparently considered legally binding invitations to settle matters immediately. Weapons were technically forbidden in many towns, especially after dark. Local governments repeatedly ordered young men not to carry swords, knives, clubs, or staffs through the streets. Teenagers responded by carrying them anyway. It's almost as if rules weren't their strongest interest. Not every confrontation became a full-scale brawl. Often, it was more about reputation than actual fighting. You couldn't let another group think you were weak. If someone challenged your friends, you stood beside them. Were you certain what had happened? Not really. Had you asked for both sides of the story? Of course not. Your friend said, "They're looking for trouble." That was apparently sufficient evidence. Adults watched these rivalries with increasing frustration. Merchants hated them because they frightened customers. Priests hated them because they disrupted public order. Town officials hated them because every fight meant paperwork, fines, witnesses, and yet another meeting about the problem with today's youth. Some council members probably dreamed of inventing adulthood several years earlier, just to calm everyone down. The funniest part is that these sworn enemies often became perfectly respectable adults later in life. The apprentice who spent his evenings chasing rivals through muddy streets eventually became the town baker. The boy throwing punches at the harvest festival grew into a respected merchant with 3 children who constantly complained about teenagers. History has a magnificent sense of humour, because somewhere decades later, that same former troublemaker was undoubtedly shaking his head at a noisy group of 15-year-olds and muttering the immortal words, "Young people just aren't what they used to be." His former opponents probably nodded in complete agreement. If there's one thing medieval adults underestimated, it was a teenager's ability to become hopelessly in love after approximately 7 seconds of eye contact. You're 15 years old. You've just spent the entire morning hauling sacks of grain, chopping wood, or learning how not to destroy your master's expensive tools. Then you arrive at the village festival. Across the square, someone smiles at you. Well, there goes your ability to think rationally for the rest of the week. Despite what films often suggest, medieval villages weren't places where young people lived completely separate lives. Markets, church services, harvest celebrations, weddings, saints' feast days, and seasonal festivals brought everyone together. For teenagers, these weren't simply community events. They were opportunities. You weren't just attending the May Day celebration. You were hoping someone specific would be there, preferably looking in your direction. Boys suddenly discovered fascinating reasons to walk past the same market stall 6 different times. Girls somehow found themselves helping near the village well far more often than strictly necessary. Historians can't fully explain this remarkable coincidence. Teenagers probably could. Dancing became one of the safest ways to flirt. During festivals, music echoed through village squares, while young people formed circles or danced in pairs under the watchful eyes of parents who pretended not to be watching. The key word there is pretended. Your mother noticed everything. Your father noticed even more. He simply expressed it by clearing his throat from 20 feet away. Courtship wasn't always straightforward. Families had opinions. Neighbours had opinions. The priest almost certainly had opinions. In medieval villages, privacy was about as rare as indoor plumbing. If you embarrassed yourself, congratulations. The entire village would probably hear about it before sunset. Love tokens also became surprisingly popular. A ribbon, a carved piece of wood, a flower, or even a simple handmade gift could quietly communicate feelings without saying a word. Unfortunately, your friends usually noticed immediately, and friends have possessed exactly the same emotional maturity throughout history. Oh, so that's why you've combed your hair today. Look who's trying to impress somebody. You immediately denied everything. Nobody believed you. Jealousy also made regular appearances. If another boy asked the person you liked to dance first, your evening could be ruined before the music had properly begun. Rivalries that began over absolutely nothing somehow became matters of enormous personal importance. From the outside, adults often found the whole thing amusing. Many had once experienced exactly the same emotions, although they preferred to pretend otherwise. Modern parents worry about teenagers spending too much time playing video games. Medieval parents had a different concern. They worried their teenagers might accidentally knock out half the village during a football match. To be fair, that was a perfectly reasonable concern. After another long day of work, you and your friends still had enough energy to sprint across fields, wrestle each other into the mud, throw heavy objects for fun, and invent competitions that would make modern insurance companies quietly close their offices forever. The most famous game was medieval football. Calling it football, however, is being extraordinarily generous. There were very few rules. Sometimes there were hundreds of players. Entire villages competed against neighbouring villages. The field could stretch across roads, streams, gardens, and open farmland. The objective was simple enough: get the ball to a certain location. How you accomplished that was open to interpretation. Kicking was allowed. Pushing was expected. Being tackled into a hedge was practically tradition. Broken windows, flattened fences, and deeply confused livestock often became innocent victims of the day's entertainment. It's no surprise that kings occasionally tried banning the sport altogether. The teenagers naturally responded by continuing to play it anyway. Some traditions are simply stronger than royal authority. Wrestling was another favourite pastime. Almost every village had young men eager to prove who was strongest. It didn't require expensive equipment, only confidence and a willingness to land face first in the dirt. Conveniently, medieval villages had an endless supply of dirt. Archery competitions were equally popular. Young men were expected to practice regularly because kingdoms depended on skilled archers during wartime. English kings even ordered their subjects to spend Sundays practicing with the longbow instead of wasting time on less useful activities. Teenagers heard this and thought, "Finally, an official excuse to shoot arrows all afternoon." Probably the only government program that sounded genuinely exciting. Then there was quarterstaff fighting. Imagine picking up a sturdy wooden pole nearly as tall as yourself and agreeing that hitting your friends with it counted as recreation. Surprisingly, this was considered excellent training. Even climbing became a competitive sport, although nobody officially admitted it. Trees, walls, rooftops, barns. If something could be climbed, a teenager eventually attempted it. Usually after someone confidently declared, "Bet you can't." Those 4 words have probably caused more unnecessary injuries than any plague in history. Adults complained constantly about dangerous games. Priests preached moderation. Town officials issued regulations. Parents warned about broken bones and unnecessary risks. Teenagers listened politely, then immediately challenged each other to see who could jump the widest ditch. Some things never change. Whether you were racing through muddy fields, wrestling beside a river, or chasing a football through 3 different farms, while someone's furious goose attacked everyone equally, medieval sports weren't just about winning. They were about showing courage, impressing your friends, catching the attention of someone you secretly liked, and proving that common sense was an obstacle best ignored until at least your 20s. History suggests that strategy remained remarkably popular. If there's one skill medieval teenagers mastered with remarkable consistency, it was believing they had a better plan than every adult around them. Sometimes they were right. Most of the time, well, that's why court records exist. By the time you reached your mid-teens, everyone seemed to have your future mapped out. Your parents expected you to continue the family trade. Your master expected years of loyal service. The local priest expected respectable behaviour. The Lord expected obedience. The only person who hadn't been consulted was you. Naturally, this created problems. One of the biggest was apprentices running away. An apprenticeship could last anywhere from 5 to 7 years, sometimes even longer. You lived in your master's house, followed his rules, worked exhausting hours, and had very little freedom. A good master could teach you a valuable profession and treat you almost like family. A bad master. Let's just say he provided excellent motivation to become an excellent runner. Records from medieval towns mention apprentices disappearing without permission, abandoning their contracts, or simply deciding that another city looked considerably more appealing. The escape plan usually sounded simple. I'll just leave. The complicated part came afterward. You had no wages saved, few possessions, and no convenient train station waiting outside the city gates. Walking to another town could take days, and if your master reported you, local officials might send you straight back. Freedom, it turned out, involved considerably more walking than expected. Some teenagers ignored rules for less dramatic reasons. Curfew? More of a suggestion. Church attendance? I'll definitely be there next week. Helping with harvest? My back suddenly hurts. It was an astonishing medical condition that disappeared the moment friends suggested going swimming in the river. Parents remained unconvinced. Then there was the eternal question of marriage. Families often had practical expectations. They considered property, reputation, financial stability, and useful alliances. Teenagers, unfortunately, insisted on introducing emotions into the discussion. Some young couples secretly met despite their parents' objections. Others exchanged small gifts, arranged quiet meetings during festivals, or found excuses to cross paths while fetching water or visiting the market. The entire village usually noticed within 3 days. Villages were wonderfully efficient at sharing information. If you whispered something on Monday, your grandmother somehow knew by Tuesday morning. And she lived 2 villages away. Occasionally young people simply disappeared together. Not forever. Just long enough to convince both families that perhaps allowing the marriage would be easier than dealing with the gossip. It wasn't common, but it happened often enough for medieval authorities to take notice. Adults constantly complained that teenagers were impatient. They wanted independence immediately, respect immediately, freedom immediately. The amusing part is that every older generation had once behaved exactly the same way. They simply remembered themselves as being much wiser. History strongly suggests otherwise. Because whether you were slipping out after curfew, sneaking away to meet someone you liked, abandoning an apprenticeship, or confidently announcing that every adult in your life was completely wrong, you were participating in one of humanity's oldest traditions, believing that this generation was the first to discover freedom, and that nobody over 30 could possibly understand it. Every teenager eventually has that one moment. You and your friends have spent the last 5 minutes confidently explaining why your latest idea is completely harmless. Then an adult appears. Unfortunately, this adult carries an official badge. The Middle Ages had no shortage of laws aimed specifically at young people. In fact, the more you read medieval town records, the more you realise that local governments spent an astonishing amount of time trying to answer one impossible question. How do we stop teenagers from behaving like teenagers? Their success rate was modest. Large medieval towns appointed officials to patrol the streets, especially after dark. Their job was to keep the peace, stop fights, prevent theft, and make sure everyone obeyed the evening curfew. Your job, apparently, was making theirs considerably more difficult. If you were caught wandering the streets long after the curfew bell had rung, expect uncomfortable questions. Where were you going? Why weren't you home? Who were your friends? Why does one of them still have a chicken under his arm? Nobody wanted to answer that last one. Street fights were one of the biggest headaches for medieval authorities. Whenever groups of apprentices or village youths started throwing punches, The watch often had to break them apart before someone reached for a knife or club. Town officials weren't necessarily shocked by the fighting. They were simply tired of writing reports about it. Some cities imposed fines. Others locked offenders in jail overnight to give them time to reconsider their life choices. Given that medieval prisons were cold, filthy, and smelled like several terrible decisions layered on top of each other, one night was usually enough. Usually, property damage brought even bigger problems. Breaking market stalls, damaging fences, smashing windows, knocking over someone's carefully stacked firewood. These weren't harmless jokes to medieval families. A damaged cart or broken tool could seriously affect someone's livelihood, meaning the prank that seemed hilarious yesterday suddenly became very expensive today. Parents often ended up paying for mistakes they hadn't even witnessed. Needless to say, they were not delighted. Church courts also dealt with young people from time to time, especially if the trouble involved disorder during religious services, public misbehaviour, or ignoring important holy days. Imagine interrupting a sermon because your friend dared you to make sheep noises. The priest would remember your name, probably forever. The funny thing is that medieval judges often showed surprising patience toward younger offenders. They understood that young people were impulsive, easily influenced by friends, and spectacularly overconfident. Some things have always been obvious. What mattered most was whether you learned from the experience. Did you apologize? Did you pay the fine? Did you stop causing trouble? The answer to that final question was occasionally. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that no punishment has ever completely cured a teenager of believing, next time, we'll be smarter. History also teaches us there is almost always a next time, which explains why medieval law books kept getting thicker, while teenagers somehow kept finding entirely new ways to end up in them. The sun has finally disappeared behind the rooftops. The church bell rings to announce the evening curfew. Respectable citizens begin closing their shutters, putting out lamps, and settling in for the night. You look at your friends. Your friends look at you. Nobody says it aloud, but everyone is thinking exactly the same thing. So, are we actually going home? Not immediately. Despite the popular image of medieval towns becoming completely silent after sunset, nighttime had a strange kind of energy, especially for young people. The streets grew darker, the crowds became smaller, and suddenly every harmless adventure felt twice as exciting simply because an adult had told you not to do it. Teenagers have always found darkness incredibly persuasive. If you were an apprentice, your master probably expected you to be asleep after another exhausting day of work. Instead, you quietly slipped outside to meet your friends. Not because you had an important meeting, because someone claimed a travelling musician had arrived at the tavern. That was reason enough. Taverns became natural gathering places. They weren't just places to drink. People shared news, listened to music, played games, told stories, and laughed about the day's disasters. Travellers brought rumours from distant towns, merchants exchanged gossip, and local musicians filled the room with songs everyone somehow knew. You, meanwhile, were pretending not to notice someone sitting across the room. Your friends noticed immediately. They were kind enough to point it out by smiling in the most suspicious way imaginable. Excellent support system. Of course, not every teenager was legally supposed to spend evenings in taverns. Some masters forbade it. Parents certainly discouraged it, which made it even more attractive. There's something almost magical about forbidden places. They become approximately 3 times more interesting the moment an adult says, "You're not going." Outside the taverns, town streets became much quieter. Without streetlights, medieval nights were genuinely dark. Moonlight helped, but narrow alleys could feel mysterious even to people who walked them every day. Every strange noise suddenly sounded larger. A cat knocked over a bucket. You briefly prepared to fight a dragon. Teenagers loved telling ghost stories during these nighttime walks. Every abandoned ruin supposedly contained spirits. Every lonely crossroads had its own legend. Every ancient tree had apparently witnessed something supernatural. The stories grew dramatically better after everyone agreed they definitely weren't scared. Nobody believed that statement, even the person saying it. Town watches patrolled many larger cities, carrying lanterns and listening for trouble. Their appearance usually produced one of two reactions. If you had done nothing wrong, you greeted them politely. If you had done something wrong, you suddenly became fascinated by the speed at which you could walk in the opposite direction without technically running. By morning, everyone returned to work as though nothing unusual had happened. The baker baked bread. The blacksmith forged iron. The apprentices swept the workshop. And every teenager silently wondered what everyone was doing after sunset tonight. Because medieval nights weren't just about breaking curfew. They were about tasting a tiny piece of independence before adulthood arrived, whether the adults approved or not. One afternoon, you're racing your friends across a muddy field, laughing because one of them has somehow fallen into a ditch for the second time this week. The next morning, someone hands you real responsibility. No ceremony, no inspiring speech, no helpful booklet titled, "Congratulations, you're an adult now." Just work. The strangest part about growing up in the Middle Ages was how suddenly everyone expected you to stop behaving like a teenager. There wasn't a universal birthday when adulthood officially began. Instead, it arrived differently depending on who you were and where you lived. Maybe you finished your apprenticeship. Maybe your father became too old to manage the farm alone. Maybe your family arranged your marriage. Maybe war arrived before any of those things had a chance to happen. Whatever the reason, one day people stopped saying, "He's just a boy." Now they were saying, "He's responsible." Those are two very different sentences. If you had completed an apprenticeship, you could finally become a journeyman. After years of sweeping floors, carrying heavy loads, and being blamed for mistakes you didn't even witness, you were now trusted to produce quality work yourself, which sounded wonderful, until you realised mistakes were now entirely your fault. No more hiding behind the master. If you stayed in the countryside, adulthood often meant taking over larger parts of the family farm. Suddenly the harvest wasn't simply your parents' concern. If the crops failed, they were your concern too. That funny little game called "I'll deal with it later" became considerably less entertaining. Marriage changed everything as well. Many people married in their late teens or early 20s, although the exact age varied greatly depending on wealth, location, and circumstance. Marriage wasn't simply about romance. It meant managing a household, raising children, producing enough food, paying rents, maintaining property, and surviving winters that didn't particularly care whether you felt prepared. Life had an extraordinary habit of assuming you were. Young noblemen faced another challenge: military service. Training with swords during childhood had seemed exciting enough. Actually leading men into battle was rather less glamorous. The armour became heavier. The consequences became permanent. For young women, adulthood meant equally demanding responsibilities. Running a household required remarkable skill. Bread had to be baked, clothing repaired, food preserved, accounts remembered, servants supervised if the family could afford them, children cared for, and countless daily problems solved before they became disasters. Nobody called it management. It absolutely was. The amusing thing is that adults often looked back on their teenage years with suspiciously selective memories. The former apprentice who had once started tavern arguments now complained that young people lacked discipline. The former village troublemaker insisted teenagers had become reckless. The man who had climbed church roofs for fun somehow became convinced he had always been perfectly sensible. History suggests his friends would have disagreed. Perhaps that is the final step into adulthood. Not paying taxes, not getting married, not finishing your apprenticeship, but forgetting just how wonderfully ridiculous you were at 16 and becoming absolutely certain that the next generation is somehow much worse. Some traditions are simply too old to disappear. After everything you've seen, from the impossible fashion trends and spectacularly bad ideas to midnight adventures and public fistfights, you might expect the ending of this story to reveal that medieval teenagers were completely different from the teenagers of today. History has other plans. Strip away the castles, the wool tunics, the muddy roads, and the church bells, and you're left with something surprisingly familiar. You, or at least someone very much like you. 800 years ago, you still wanted freedom before you were quite ready for it. You wanted adults to trust you while simultaneously giving them excellent reasons not to. You believed your friends knew everything, your parents understood nothing, and the future would somehow work itself out. It usually did. Eventually, medieval adults complained endlessly that young people were lazy, disrespectful, obsessed with appearance, distracted by romance, unwilling to work hard enough, and constantly inventing new ways to waste time. If you've heard those complaints before, congratulations. You've discovered the longest-running conversation in human history. In fact, every generation seems absolutely convinced that they were the last sensible one. The Romans complained about young people. Medieval parents complained about young people. Victorian parents complained about young people. Today, someone is probably complaining about young people, while a teenager nearby is confidently explaining why the adults just don't get it. The cycle remains beautifully unbroken. Of course, medieval teenagers faced challenges that would seem unimaginable today. Many left home before they were old enough to vote by modern standards. They worked exhausting days, survived deadly diseases, and lived in a world where a poor harvest could threaten an entire community. Yet somehow, even surrounded by those hardships, they still found time to laugh with friends, fall hopelessly in love, wear clothes their parents hated, stay out later than they should, pull ridiculous pranks, argue with authority, and chase excitement whenever life gave them the smallest opportunity. Human nature, it seems, has always been stronger than circumstance. Perhaps that's why medieval records are so enjoyable to read. They're filled with kings, bishops, knights, and great battles. But hidden between those famous stories are ordinary teenagers trying to figure out who they were, sometimes brilliantly, often disastrously, almost always entertainingly, and maybe that's the biggest surprise of all. The Middle Ages weren't populated by silent, gloomy people endlessly struggling through life without smiling. They joked, argued, flirted, competed, made terrible decisions, embarrassed themselves in public, and occasionally forced exhausted adults to invent entirely new rules because the old ones clearly weren't working. In other words, they grew up, just like every generation before them, and every generation since. So the next time someone claims that teenagers have completely lost their minds, and that things were far better back in the old days, remember the medieval apprentice wearing absurdly pointy shoes, sneaking out after curfew to meet friends, starting a fight over an insult he couldn't even remember the next morning, then arriving home convinced that none of it had been his fault. History would simply smile and quietly reply, "We've seen this before." When you think of ancient fashion, your mind probably jumps straight to white marble statues wrapped in flowing robes, Egyptian pharaohs wearing impossible amounts of gold, or Roman senators looking permanently overdressed for the weather. It all seems wonderfully distant, preserved behind museum glass and history books thick enough to stun an ox. But look a little closer, and something rather surprising begins to happen. Many of the clothes, accessories, and beauty habits you see every day are not modern inventions at all. They are simply very old ideas wearing new labels. Fashion, despite its reputation for constantly changing, is remarkably stubborn. It loves pretending to reinvent itself while quietly borrowing from civilizations that disappeared thousands of years ago. Humans have always wanted to look attractive, display status, stay comfortable, and occasionally make their neighbours just a little bit jealous. The methods change. The motivations rarely do. Thousands of years before fashion magazines declared what was in or out, people along the Nile River carefully applied cosmetics before leaving home. Greek craftsmen stitched elegant sandals that would not look entirely out of place on today's beaches. Roman women layered garments in ways that modern designers still imitate, while wealthy Persians experimented with luxurious fabrics and tailored clothing that would influence fashion for centuries. Even jewellery tells the same story. Rings, necklaces, bracelets, earrings, hairpins, and decorative belts have survived not because they are ancient curiosities, but because they simply work. Gold still shines exactly as it did when Egyptian nobles admired it beneath the desert sun. Pearls remain elegant despite having been fashionable since long before Julius Caesar was making political enemies at an impressive pace. Of course, not every ancient trend deserves a comeback. Some hairstyles required enough oil to fry tonight's dinner, and certain cosmetics contained ingredients that modern doctors would describe with considerable concern. Looking fashionable was occasionally a dangerous hobby. Vanity has always demanded sacrifices, although preferably not involving lead poisoning. One of the biggest misconceptions about ancient clothing is that everyone dressed alike. In reality, fashion changed constantly, depending on wealth, occupation, region, climate, religion, and social status. A Roman senator dressed very differently from a Roman baker, just as an Egyptian queen hardly resembled the farmer harvesting grain outside Memphis. Over the next chapters, you'll discover that ancient wardrobes were far more sophisticated than most people imagine. From timeless sandals to layered clothing, from perfumes to cosmetics, from carefully chosen colours to luxurious fabrics. Many of today's biggest fashion trends are not new creations at all. They are simply history's favourite outfits making yet another entrance, proving that while civilizations may rise and fall, good style is remarkably difficult to bury. If there is one piece of ancient fashion that absolutely refused to stay in the past, it is the humble sandal. Long before sneakers conquered the world, and long before anyone argued about limited edition trainers, people had already discovered that a flat sole attached to your foot with a few well-placed straps was surprisingly difficult to improve upon. The story begins thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt. Walking barefoot on cool stone floors inside temples was pleasant enough, but crossing hot desert sand was another matter entirely. Egyptians crafted sandals from woven papyrus reeds, palm fibres, leather, and occasionally wood. Simpler versions belonged to farmers and labourers, while elaborate sandals decorated with dyed leather, embroidery, or even gold leaf were reserved for the wealthy. Pharaohs took footwear particularly seriously. Some royal sandals featured images of Egypt's enemies painted onto the soles. Every step literally placed foreign rivals beneath the ruler's feet. It was political propaganda expressed through footwear. Modern branding suddenly feels rather unimaginative. As Mediterranean civilizations grew, so did sandal design. The Greeks transformed practicality into elegance. Their sandals were carefully shaped to fit the foot and secured with leather straps that wrapped gracefully around the ankle. Shoemakers experimented with different patterns, creating styles that distinguished men from women and citizens from soldiers. Beauty mattered immensely in Greek society. A well-crafted sandal complemented flowing garments and balanced the proportions of the body, reflecting the Greek fascination with harmony. Even footwear became part of their philosophy that beauty and function should exist together. The Romans, naturally, approached the subject with typical efficiency. They created dozens of different sandal styles, depending on occupation and status. Soldiers marched across Europe wearing sturdy military sandals called caligae, fitted with thick leather soles reinforced by iron hobnails. These shoes endured mud, mountains, forests, and battlefields with remarkable reliability. Meanwhile, wealthy Roman citizens wore softer leather sandals indoors, while senators and magistrates often displayed distinctive footwear that immediately revealed their rank. In Rome, people could often judge your profession before you spoke simply by looking at your feet. Fast forward 2,000 years, and ancient ideas continue walking beside us. Every summer, fashion magazines enthusiastically announce the return of leather sandals, lace-up sandals, minimalist sandals, or the famous gladiator sandal. Designers unveil them as exciting new collections, while somewhere an ancient Roman shoemaker would probably smile and quietly wonder what took everyone so long. Some trends disappear forever. Others simply wait patiently until the world remembers how comfortable they were. Sandals belong firmly in the second category, proving that sometimes the oldest solutions remain the smartest ones. If you walked into the dressing room of a wealthy Egyptian noblewoman around 3,000 years ago, you might be surprised by how familiar it looked. There would be mirrors polished from bronze, carefully carved cosmetic containers, scented oils, small brushes, powders, and pigments arranged with impressive care. The only obvious difference would be the absence of electric lighting and someone explaining a 12-step skincare routine on social media. Ancient people did not simply throw on whatever was available. Cosmetics were a serious business, combining fashion, religion, medicine, and social status into a daily ritual. The Egyptians were perhaps the undisputed masters of ancient beauty. Both men and women regularly lined their eyes with black coal, creating the dramatic almond-shaped look that still appears on fashion runways today. The dark lines were undeniably beautiful, but they also served practical purposes. They reduced the glare of the powerful Egyptian sun and helped protect sensitive eyes from blowing sand. Some ingredients even had mild antibacterial properties, meaning that looking elegant occasionally came with genuine health benefits. It may be one of the few moments in beauty history when makeup could honestly claim to improve your well-being. Green eyeshadow also became fashionable, made from crushed malachite, while red ochre provided colour for lips and cheeks. Wealthier Egyptians stored these cosmetics inside beautifully carved stone jars or ivory containers, transforming makeup into both an art and a luxury. The Greeks admired a rather different ideal. They favoured smoother, paler skin, believing it reflected refinement and a life spent indoors rather than working beneath the Mediterranean sun. Women applied powders to lighten their complexions and used subtle colours on their lips and cheeks. Unfortunately, not every beauty secret aged as gracefully as the hairstyles. Some whitening products contained lead compounds, which produced the desired appearance while quietly causing serious health problems. The mirror rarely mentioned this unfortunate detail. Roman women inherited many Greek practices but expanded them dramatically. Cosmetic recipes circulated throughout the empire, perfumes arrived from Arabia and India, and expensive creams promised softer skin, fewer wrinkles, and greater beauty. If those promises sound familiar, congratulations. Advertising has apparently changed very little over the last 2,000 years. Even skincare became an obsession. Milk baths, honey masks, olive oil cleansers, and herbal lotions were all recommended by Roman writers. Some treatments genuinely moisturized the skin, while others probably worked best by convincing people they had invested enough money to feel prettier. Today, eyeliner, lipstick, blush, perfume, facial creams, and elaborate skincare routines fill bathroom shelves across the world. They may come in sleeker packaging, but the desire behind them remains ancient. Fashion evolves, trends come and go, but humanity's determination to look refreshed after a poor night's sleep appears to be completely timeless. Layering clothes feels like a thoroughly modern invention. Open any autumn fashion magazine and you'll find endless advice about combining jackets, scarves, sweaters, shirts, and accessories into the perfect outfit. Yet people mastered the art of layering thousands of years before anyone coined the phrase fall collection. The ancient world understood something that never goes out of style. Wearing several lighter garments is often far more practical than relying on one heavy piece of clothing. In ancient Greece, the basic wardrobe began with the chiton, a simple tunic made from linen or wool, but it rarely stopped there. Depending on the weather, the occasion, or a person's wealth, another garment called the himation could be draped over the shoulders. It functioned somewhere between a cloak, a shawl, and a stylish overcoat. The fabric folded naturally around the body, creating elegant lines without a single button or zipper. How you arranged those folds mattered. A neatly draped himation suggested education, refinement, and self-control. Wrapping it carelessly might imply you had dressed in the dark or had lost an argument with your own wardrobe. The Romans adopted many Greek ideas, but made them even more structured. Most citizens wore a simple tunic close to the body, adding heavier cloaks when temperatures dropped. Senators and magistrates wore the famous toga over their tunics during official occasions, though despite its iconic reputation, the toga was hardly everyday wear. In fact, many Romans found it bulky, uncomfortable, and difficult to manage. Wearing one properly often required practice or assistance. Imagine needing help simply to get dressed before attending a meeting. Suddenly, wrestling with a modern necktie feels considerably less dramatic. Beyond the Mediterranean, the Persians took layering to another level. Living across climates that ranged from hot plains to cold mountain regions, they developed wardrobes that included trousers, long-sleeved tunics, fitted jackets, cloaks, and decorative belts. Their clothing emphasized comfort while allowing freedom of movement, particularly for horsemen who spent long hours riding across the empire. Persian tailoring impressed neighboring civilizations so much that elements of it gradually spread westward. The idea of fitted outer garments, worn over lighter layers, would eventually influence fashion throughout Europe. Layering also allowed people to display wealth without saying a word. Rich fabrics beneath expensive cloaks, colourful borders peeking from underneath outer garments, embroidered sleeves appearing at just the right moment, all quietly announced prosperity. Today, we casually combine shirts, jackets, coats, scarves, and cardigans without giving the concept much thought. Fashion brands present layered outfits as seasonal innovations every few years. The Greeks, Romans, and Persians might politely applaud the effort before pointing out that they had already perfected the look, while your great-great-great-grandparents' ancestors were still figuring out how sleeves worked. If you were suddenly transported into the marketplace of ancient Rome, Egypt, or Greece, one thing would become obvious almost immediately. People loved jewellery. Not just kings and queens, but merchants, soldiers, priests, wealthy landowners, and anyone who could afford even the smallest decorative piece. Some things simply refuse to go out of fashion. Gold is one of them. Ancient Egyptians believed jewellery was far more than decoration. every necklace, bracelet, ring, or amulet could carry religious meaning, offer protection from evil spirits, or symbolize divine favor. Gold was especially treasured because it never tarnished. To the Egyptians, this eternal shine reflected the flesh of the gods themselves. A noblewoman might wear elaborate collars made from rows of gold, turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian beads. Broad bracelets covered both wrists, rings adorned nearly every finger, and earrings framed carefully styled hair. None of it was considered excessive. Quite the opposite. Displaying beautiful craftsmanship honoured both wealth and the gods. Modern jewellery advertisements often promise timeless elegance. Ancient Egypt quietly demonstrated what timeless actually looks like. The Greeks approached jewellery somewhat differently. They admired balance and subtle beauty. Gold wreaths resembling olive leaves, delicate earrings shaped like tiny animals, and necklaces with carefully worked pendants reflected their appreciation for nature and proportion. Jewellery complemented the body, rather than overwhelming it. Of course, if you happened to be exceptionally wealthy, subtlety occasionally took a holiday. Then came the Romans, who embraced nearly every style they encountered across their growing empire. Their jewellers imported pearls from the Persian Gulf, emeralds from Egypt, sapphires from distant lands, amber from northern Europe, and precious stones from as far away as India. Roman elites became passionate collectors. Rings multiplied, necklaces grew heavier, bracelets climbed higher up the arm, and gemstones became visible proof that their owner possessed both wealth and excellent trade connections. Julius Caesar himself reportedly admired pearls so much that he helped turn them into one of Rome's greatest luxury obsessions. At extravagant banquets, guests often wore enough jewellery to finance a respectable farm. Not every ornament served purely decorative purposes. Signet rings carried family seals used to stamp wax on important documents, making them both fashionable and practical. They functioned almost like personal signatures worn on the hand. Today, engagement rings, gold chains, pearl earrings, charm bracelets, layered necklaces, and gemstone rings continue filling jewellery stores around the world. Their designs may be simplified or modernised, but their origins stretch astonishingly far into the past. People often say that diamonds are forever. Ancient history gently reminds us that humanity's desire to decorate itself with beautiful things has lasted even longer. Across empires that rose and vanished, through wars, plagues, and changing civilizations, gold kept shining, pearls kept glowing, and people kept admiring themselves in the nearest reflective surface. Some habits, it seems, are truly immortal. Long before fashion houses announced that this year's colour was the one everyone absolutely needed, ancient civilizations already understood that colour could speak louder than words. It could reveal your wealth, your profession, your family, your beliefs, and sometimes even whether people were expected to bow when you walked into the room. In the ancient world, colour was never just decoration. Take purple, for example. Today, you can buy a purple shirt without giving it much thought. 2,000 years ago, owning one could place you among the richest people in the Mediterranean. The famous Tyrian purple dye was extracted from tiny sea snails found along the eastern Mediterranean coast. Producing even a small amount required thousands of shells and an astonishing amount of labour. The process was slow, unpleasant, and smelled so dreadful that dye workshops were usually built well away from cities. Apparently, luxury occasionally came with the aroma of something that had made several poor life choices. The expense made purple a symbol of enormous prestige. Roman emperors eventually claimed it almost exclusively for themselves. Certain shades became so closely associated with imperial power that wearing them without permission could lead to serious consequences. Accidentally copying the emperor's outfit was not considered a harmless fashion mistake. White carried its own importance. Greek citizens often wore clean white garments during festivals and religious ceremonies, symbolizing purity and respect for the gods. Roman politicians also favored bright white togas when campaigning for public office. In fact, the Latin word candidus, meaning brilliantly white, gave us the modern word candidate. The idea was simple enough. If your clothes looked spotless, perhaps your character did as well. History, of course, suggests that laundry alone was not always enough. Egyptians embraced lighter colours for practical reasons. White linen reflected the desert sun while remaining comfortable in intense heat. Wealthier Egyptians sometimes added colourful decorative borders dyed in reds, blues, greens and yellows using minerals and plant-based pigments. Bright colours demonstrated access to skilled craftsmen and expensive materials. Across Persia, brilliant reds, deep blues, emerald greens, and richly patterned textiles became hallmarks of aristocratic dress. Royal courts celebrated vibrant fabrics that reflected both artistic sophistication and the empire's vast trade networks stretching across Asia. Today, colour continues performing many of the same jobs it did in antiquity. Black suggests elegance. White still appears at weddings in much of the Western world. Purple retains an association with luxury. Gold evokes prestige, while red confidently attracts attention. Fashion may constantly invent new palettes, but the emotional language of colour has remained surprisingly consistent. Thousands of years separate us from the Egyptians, Greeks, Romans and Persians, yet we still instinctively understand what they understood all along. Sometimes the first thing people notice about you is not the cut of your clothes. It is simply the colour you chose to wear. Hair has always been one of fashion's favourite ways to make a statement. Unlike expensive jewellery or luxurious fabrics, nearly everyone had hair to work with, making it one of the most accessible forms of self-expression in the ancient world. Whether carefully curled, braided, tied, or piled high above the head, hairstyles often revealed just as much about a person as their clothing did. And surprisingly, many of today's most popular hairstyles would have looked perfectly at home thousands of years ago. Ancient Egypt offers one of the earliest examples. While many people kept their natural hair short for comfort in the desert heat, wigs became an entire fashion industry. Wealthy men and women owned several wigs for different occasions, crafted from human hair, wool, or plant fibres. These wigs could be braided, curled, scented with perfume, and decorated with beads or gold ornaments. Owning multiple hairstyles without waiting months for your hair to grow was apparently not invented by modern celebrities. The Greeks preferred a softer, more natural elegance. Women often wore long hair gathered into loose buns at the back of the head, secured with ribbons, pins, or decorative bands. Braids framed the face, while gentle curls were admired as symbols of beauty and refinement. These hairstyles were not rushed affairs. Household servants often spent considerable time arranging every strand. Looking effortlessly graceful usually required quite a bit of effort behind the scenes, a tradition that remains remarkably alive today. Roman fashion, however, took hairstyling to extraordinary levels. During the imperial period, wealthy Roman women competed to create increasingly elaborate hairstyles. Hair was curled into dozens of tiny ringlets, braided into towering structures, and supported by pins, wireframes, and occasionally even additional hair purchased from across the empire. Blonde hair imported from Northern Europe became especially fashionable. Roman ladies sometimes wore wigs made from the hair of Germanic women, while darker hair from the East was equally prized. Fashion had become international long before anyone thought of calling it global. The more elaborate the hairstyle, the clearer the message. Its owner possessed enough wealth to employ servants, whose full-time responsibility was arranging hair. Men followed trends as well. Julius Caesar famously combed his thinning hair forward to hide his baldness, while later emperors carefully influenced male hairstyles throughout the empire. Apparently, worrying about receding hairlines is another ancient tradition. Today, braided crowns, sleek buns, beach waves, curtain bangs, elaborate updos, hair extensions, and even wigs appear on red carpets and fashion shows around the world. The mirrors have changed. The styling tools have certainly improved. But if an ancient Roman or Greek stepped into a modern salon, they would recognize many of the hairstyles immediately. They might simply ask why everyone insists on calling them the newest trend. Long before anyone walked through an airport duty-free shop wondering whether they really needed another bottle of perfume, ancient civilizations had already developed a fascination with fragrance. In fact, perfume is one of humanity's oldest luxury industries, dating back thousands of years. While clothing catches the eye, scent has always been the invisible finishing touch that completes an appearance. The Egyptians were among the first true masters of perfume. Fragrance surrounded nearly every aspect of daily life. Temples burned sweet-smelling incense during religious ceremonies, homes were filled with aromatic oils, and both men and women applied scented balms before attending feasts or important gatherings. Cleanliness and pleasant scents were closely linked with beauty, health, and even holiness. One of the most recognizable Egyptian beauty rituals involved wearing cones of scented wax on top of elaborate wigs during celebrations. As the evening grew warmer, the wax slowly melted, releasing perfumes made from myrrh, cinnamon, lotus flowers, and other precious ingredients. It sounds unusual today, but compared to spraying yourself with artificial ocean breeze before sitting in an air-conditioned office, perhaps it is not quite as strange as it first appears. The Greeks expanded perfume into an art form. Different fragrances suited different occasions. Athletes scented themselves after bathing, guests applied perfume before banquets, and temples filled with carefully chosen aromas during religious festivals. Philosophers occasionally complained that people wore too much perfume, proving that someone has always believed everyone else is overdoing it. The Romans, naturally, embraced the trend with enthusiasm. Perfume flowed throughout Roman society. Wealthy citizens scented their hair, clothes, furniture, dining rooms, and even household pets. Banquet halls sometimes featured rose petals scattered across the floor, while servants sprayed fragrant water into the air between courses. Roman writers occasionally mocked this obsession, joking that some citizens could be smelled before they could be seen. For centuries, Roman authors simply could not stop writing about the Germanic tribes. Again and again, these northern peoples appeared in military reports, historical accounts, biographies, poems, and political speeches. Some writers admired them, others feared them, many exaggerated them. Yet almost every Roman who wrote about the frontiers seemed to have an opinion. The question is, why? After all, Rome ruled an empire stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the misty hills of Britain. It commanded cities filled with marble temples, aqueducts, libraries, theatres, and roads that seemed to reach every corner of the known world. Compared to such grandeur, the forests beyond the Rhine River appeared wild, remote, and sparsely populated. And yet those forests fascinated the Romans far more than many of the provinces they actually controlled. To understand why, imagine yourself as a Roman merchant or soldier standing on the western bank of the Rhine during the 1st century after Christ. Behind you lies one of the greatest empires in history. Before you stretches an immense wilderness of dark forests, broad rivers, marshes and hills that disappear into the distance. There are no Roman roads cutting neatly through the landscape. No cities built around forums and bathhouses. No familiar villas surrounded by vineyards. Somewhere beyond the trees live dozens of tribes whose languages sound unfamiliar, whose customs seem strange, and whose leaders owe absolutely nothing to Rome. Naturally, curiosity begins to grow. The first stories came from traders who exchanged goods along the frontier. They spoke of tall warriors with unusually light hair, villages built from timber instead of stone, and societies where loyalty to family and tribe mattered more than written laws. Then came the soldiers. Roman legions stationed along the Rhine encountered these tribes regularly. Sometimes they traded peacefully, sometimes they negotiated. Occasionally, they recruited Germanic warriors as allies. And quite often, they fought them. Every encounter produced another story. One officer described fearless warriors charging into battle with astonishing confidence. Another recalled enormous drinking feasts that lasted well into the night. A diplomat returned impressed by tribal assemblies where free men debated important decisions rather than simply obeying kings. Of course, not every account was perfectly reliable. Roman writers often described lands they had never personally visited. Many relied on second-hand reports passed from soldier to soldier, merchant to merchant, until facts blended comfortably with rumour. The farther a story travelled from the frontier, the more dramatic it often became. Apparently, embellishing travel stories is another tradition with very ancient roots. Still, beneath the exaggerations lay something genuine. The Germanic tribes represented one of the few neighbouring peoples that Rome never fully understood or permanently conquered. They remained unpredictable, independent, and deeply different from the Mediterranean world. That combination of mystery, admiration, and fear ensured that Roman authors would keep writing about them for centuries, trying to explain a people who always seemed just beyond Rome's complete understanding. As Roman merchants and soldiers carried stories back across the Rhine, one detail appeared so consistently that it almost became impossible to ignore. According to them, the Germanic tribes were enormous. Nearly every Roman author who described these northern peoples found a way to mention their height. Julius Caesar noted their impressive physical stature during his campaigns in Gaul. Later, the historian Tacitus described the Germans as having fierce blue eyes, reddish or blonde hair, and large, powerful bodies suited to sudden bursts of strength. Reading several Roman accounts in succession, you could almost believe every Germanic warrior stood somewhere between a respectable human being and a small oak tree. Like most stereotypes, however, there was a grain of truth wrapped in generous layers of exaggeration. Archaeological discoveries suggest that many Germanic men were indeed somewhat taller than the average Roman living around the Mediterranean. Better access to animal protein in some regions, combined with different lifestyles and genetics, likely contributed to this difference. While the average Roman male may have stood around 5 feet 6 inches, some Germanic populations averaged slightly taller. The difference was noticeable. Standing beside a line of broad-shouldered warriors with long limbs and thick blonde hair, a Roman recruit fresh from southern Italy may well have felt considerably less confident than he had that morning. Of course, appearance alone can become a weapon. Germanic warriors understood the value of intimidation. Many grew their hair long and allowed full beards to develop, creating an even more imposing figure. Before battle, some reportedly shouted, clashed weapons against shields, and rushed forward in tightly packed groups, magnifying the impression that an unstoppable wall of giants was approaching. Fear has an interesting habit of adding a few extra inches to one's enemy. Roman writers were also fascinated by complexion. Living in northern climates, many Germanic peoples had lighter skin and fairer hair than the Mediterranean populations Romans encountered most often. Blonde hair became one of their defining characteristics in Roman literature. Ironically, this fascination eventually turned into fashion. Roman aristocratic women began importing blonde hair from Germanic territories to create wigs and hairpieces. What had once been described as the appearance of foreign barbarians slowly became one of Rome's most desirable beauty trends. It is one of history's more amusing contradictions that elite Roman ladies sometimes paid handsomely to resemble the very people Roman generals were campaigning against. Still, the Roman image of the towering German was never entirely objective. Ancient historians loved dramatic contrasts. By portraying the Germanic tribes as unusually strong, physically impressive opponents, Roman victories appeared even more glorious. Defeating an ordinary enemy was respectable. Defeating towering warriors from the endless northern forests sounded far better when the story reached Rome. And so, generation after generation, Roman readers continued encountering the same unforgettable image. Beyond the Rhine lived a people who seemed larger than life, both in stature and in reputation. For all their descriptions of battles, diplomacy, and distant forests, Roman authors displayed a surprising fascination with one particular subject: hair. Again and again, they paused their accounts of military campaigns to describe hairstyles in remarkable detail. Not weapons, not fortifications. Hair. To a modern reader, it may seem like an unusual priority. Surely there were more pressing matters than discussing how people styled their locks beyond the Rhine. But to the Romans, appearance carried meaning. Clothing, beards, jewellery, and hairstyles immediately communicated status, identity, and even character. Looking at someone's hair was often like reading the first page of their biography. Among all the Germanic hairstyles, none attracted more attention than the famous Swabian knot. The Suebi were one of the largest and most influential Germanic tribal groups, living east of the Rhine during the 1st century before and after Christ. Roman writers, especially Tacitus, described how Swabian men gathered their long hair and tied it into a knot high on one side of the head. It was not simply a matter of fashion. According to Tacitus, free men wore the distinctive knot as a symbol of their status, while older warriors and tribal leaders often styled it with particular care. It marked adulthood, freedom, and prestige. You could identify a man's social standing before he even introduced himself. Imagine if your haircut instantly announced your profession, age, and place in society. Suddenly choosing between a trim and a fade feels refreshingly uncomplicated. Long hair itself held enormous importance across many Germanic societies. Unlike Roman soldiers, who usually kept their hair relatively short for practicality, Germanic warriors often allowed theirs to grow for years. Thick beards completed the appearance, creating the fierce image that so impressed Roman observers. Some tribes even treated hair as a sacred symbol. Historical sources suggest that certain warriors avoided cutting their hair until they had proved themselves in battle or fulfilled an important vow. Victory sometimes granted the right to change one's appearance, turning a simple haircut into a celebration of courage. Roman soldiers certainly noticed. On the battlefield, lines of warriors with flowing blonde or reddish hair, full beards, brightly painted shields, and towering spears created an unforgettable sight. Before combat even began, appearance had already become part of psychological warfare. The Romans, despite their fascination, did not entirely dismiss these hairstyles as barbaric. In fact, they often admired their boldness. Ironically, fashion once again crossed the frontier. As contact between Rome and the Germanic tribes increased, blonde hair became highly fashionable among Roman elites. Wealthy women purchased wigs made from hair imported from Germanic regions, while others attempted to lighten their own hair using various dyes and mixtures, some effective, others better described as optimistic chemistry. So while Roman historians continued calling the Germanic tribes barbarians, Roman society quietly borrowed one of their most recognizable features. It is one of history's recurring patterns. First, you criticize your neighbor's style, then, a few years later, everyone in the capital wants to copy it. The more Roman soldiers encountered the Germanic tribes, the more one fact became impossible to ignore. These warriors did not fight like Romans. To the Roman military mind, war was a carefully organized machine. A legion marched in formation, built fortified camps every evening, followed strict chains of command, and relied on discipline above all else. Victory came through training, engineering, and patience. The Germanic tribes seemed to operate according to entirely different rules. That difference fascinated Roman writers almost as much as it frustrated Roman generals. Julius Caesar was among the first to comment extensively on Germanic warfare. He described tribes that valued courage above comfort, and warriors who spent much of their lives hunting, raiding, and training for conflict. Unlike Rome's professional standing army, Germanic forces were usually assembled when danger or opportunity appeared. A farmer in spring might become a warrior by summer and return to his fields after the campaign ended. To Romans accustomed to full-time soldiers, this seemed remarkably unpredictable. Germanic warriors also carried equipment that differed from the familiar Roman arsenal. Their most common weapon was the spear, often called the framea by Roman authors. It was relatively light, making it effective both for throwing and for close combat. Combined with a round or oval wooden shield, it allowed warriors to move quickly across difficult terrain. Swords certainly existed, but they were expensive possessions. A finely forged blade required considerable skill and valuable iron, placing it beyond the reach of many ordinary freemen. Spears remained the dependable tool of both war and hunting. Roman observers often remarked that many Germanic warriors wore little armour. Some fought with only shields and thick woolen clothing, while wealthier leaders might possess chainmail or helmets obtained through trade, inheritance, or battlefield spoils. To Roman officers, this appeared reckless. Yet it also made Germanic warriors astonishingly mobile. Dense forests, muddy riverbanks, steep hills, and marshes were poor places for heavy formations. Small groups of lightly equipped fighters could move through these landscapes with remarkable speed, striking unexpectedly before disappearing back into terrain they knew intimately. Then there was the noise. Roman historians repeatedly mention the tremendous shouting that erupted before battle. Warriors raised spears, beat swords against shields, and unleashed deafening war cries designed to intimidate their opponents before the first blow was struck. Tacitus even described how they held their shields close to their mouths to amplify their voices, creating a deeper, echoing roar across the battlefield. Whether every tribe actually fought this way is difficult to know, but the effect on Roman imagination was undeniable. The greatest demonstration of these different tactics came in the year 9 after Christ, when the Cherusci leader Arminius lured 3 Roman legions into the dense Teutoburg forest. There, disciplined formations struggled against ambushes, rough terrain, and relentless attacks from warriors who understood every path and every tree. The battle shocked Rome. For Roman authors, it proved that these northern tribes were not merely fierce, they fought according to a style the empire had never fully learned how to master. After reading Roman descriptions of Germanic warriors, it would be easy to imagine that they spent every waking moment fighting. Roman authors certainly enjoyed emphasizing battles, raids, and fearless charges across muddy fields. But once the swords were put away, what fascinated many writers even more was how differently these people organized their everyday lives. The Germanic world looked almost like the opposite of Rome. A Roman citizen measured civilization by its cities. Rome itself was home to perhaps 1 million people. Stone apartment buildings crowded narrow streets. Aqueducts delivered fresh water. Public baths, temples, theatres, markets and forums filled every neighbourhood. Wherever Roman armies conquered, they built roads and towns that reflected the same orderly vision. Cross the Rhine, however, and that familiar landscape disappeared. Instead of sprawling cities, Roman travellers found scattered villages surrounded by forests, rivers, meadows and farmland. Houses were built primarily from timber, with walls woven from branches and covered in clay. Thick thatched roofs protected families from harsh northern winters, while smoke escaped through simple openings rather than carefully engineered chimneys. To Roman eyes, these settlements seemed surprisingly modest. Tacitus even remarked that Germanic villages left generous spaces between houses rather than packing buildings closely together as Romans did. Some historians believe this reduced the risk of fire spreading from home to home. Others suggest it reflected the abundance of available land. Either way, the result must have seemed remarkably spacious to someone arriving from crowded Roman streets. The houses themselves were practical rather than impressive. Furniture remained simple, decoration was limited, and daily life centered around large communal rooms where families cooked, ate, worked, and slept together. Livestock often stayed nearby, especially during colder months, making winter mornings considerably louder and probably smellier than those inside a Roman villa. Comfort, however, meant something different in Germania. Roman writers often interpreted the absence of marble buildings as evidence of simplicity, even backwardness. Yet archaeological discoveries tell a more balanced story. Germanic craftsmen produced excellent wooden structures, forged high-quality iron tools, created beautiful jewellery, and managed productive farms adapted perfectly to their environment. They simply invested their resources differently. Land itself carried enormous importance. Wealth was measured less by luxurious homes than by livestock, fertile fields, loyal followers, and strong family connections. A respected tribal leader gained prestige not through towering monuments, but through generosity, courage, and the support of his community. This puzzled many Roman observers. How could societies function without grand cities, stone forums, or monumental architecture? Where were the public buildings that symbolized civilization? The answer was that Germanic society did not need Rome's definition of civilization to thrive. Their villages blended naturally into the landscape. Their communities relied on kinship instead of urban bureaucracy, and their world revolved around forests and fields rather than marble squares. To Roman authors, it felt unfamiliar. To the people who lived there, it simply felt like home. As Roman writers gradually looked beyond the battlefield, they discovered something that surprised them almost as much as the Germanic warriors themselves. These northern tribes were not constantly preparing for war. They also loved to gather, feast, drink, and welcome guests with remarkable generosity. In fact, some Roman authors believed hospitality was one of the defining virtues of Germanic society. Tacitus, writing near the end of the 1st century after Christ, described a culture where refusing hospitality to a stranger was considered deeply dishonourable. A traveller arriving at a village did not need to knock on several doors, hoping someone would take pity on him. Instead, he was often invited inside, offered food, drink, and a place by the fire. To a Roman accustomed to crowded cities where strangers could easily disappear into the masses, this openness was striking. Once inside, the guest became part of the household, at least for a short while. Meals were usually straightforward but filling. Bread made from barley or other grains appeared regularly, along with cheese, butter, milk, and whatever meat hunting or livestock provided. Wild boar, venison, beef, and pork all found their way onto wooden tables, while fish supplemented diets near rivers and lakes. The food lacked the elaborate sauces and countless courses of wealthy Roman banquets, but no one left hungry. Drink occupied an equally important place. Roman writers frequently remarked that Germanic tribes consumed large quantities of beer brewed from barley or wheat, while mead made from fermented honey remained a prized drink for celebrations. Wine existed, but was relatively uncommon, imported through trade with Roman merchants, and therefore considered something of a luxury. Naturally, Roman authors could not resist commenting on the drinking habits of their northern neighbours. Some claimed arguments occasionally erupted after long evenings of drinking, with disputes settled by wrestling matches or, less ideally, by reaching for weapons. Whether these stories reflected everyday reality or simply Roman stereotypes is difficult to know. Ancient historians were rarely guilty of understating a colourful scene. More important than the food itself was what happened around it. Feasts strengthened friendships, confirmed alliances, celebrated victories, arranged marriages, and welcomed important visitors. Tribal leaders demonstrated their generosity by providing abundant food and drink, earning loyalty not through taxes or salaries, but through personal relationships. Young warriors gathered around successful chiefs, attracted by their reputation, courage, and generosity. The bond worked both ways. A leader gained honour through loyal followers, while followers gained prestige by serving an admired leader. Roman observers found this system fascinating because it relied less on written laws and official offices than on trust, reputation, and mutual obligation. Over shared meals, promises were made, stories were remembered, and loyalties were reinforced. To the Romans, these feasts revealed something important. Beyond the fierce warriors described in military reports, stood communities held together not only by strength, but also by hospitality, shared traditions, and the simple act of gathering around a table together. The more Roman authors observed the Germanic tribes, the more they encountered something they struggled to categorize. These societies had kings in some regions, powerful chiefs in others, respected elders almost everywhere, yet they did not resemble the rigid political structure that Romans considered essential for civilization. To many Romans, it seemed almost chaotic, and yet somehow it worked. One of the themes that appears repeatedly in Roman writings is the remarkable importance the Germanic tribes placed on personal freedom. Tacitus noted that important matters were not simply decided by a ruler giving orders. Instead, tribal assemblies brought together free men to discuss disputes, approve military campaigns, settle legal matters, and even choose leaders. The discussions were not always calm. Roman writers describe meetings filled with loud voices, applause, and disagreement. Men signalled approval by striking their spears against their shields, creating a thunderous sound that echoed through the gathering. If they disliked a proposal, they voiced their disapproval just as openly. To a Roman senator accustomed to formal debates beneath marble roofs, these open-air assemblies must have seemed both fascinating and slightly alarming. Leadership itself worked differently. A tribal chief could not simply command loyalty because he inherited power. He had to earn it continually through courage, generosity, wisdom, and success in war. A leader who repeatedly failed could quickly lose followers, while a brave young warrior with growing prestige might attract more supporters with every successful campaign. Respect had to be maintained. It was not guaranteed. Honour played an equally central role. Roman authors frequently mention the relationship between a chief and his personal war band, known today through the Latin term comitatus. These elite companions voluntarily attached themselves to a respected leader, promising absolute loyalty in battle. The expectations ran both ways. a chief was expected to reward his followers with gifts, weapons, horses, and opportunities for glory. In return, abandoning one's leader during combat was considered one of the greatest disgraces imaginable. Tacitus even remarked that surviving a battle after your chief had fallen could bring lasting shame. Whether every tribe followed this principle so strictly remains uncertain, but the story reveals how deeply Romans believed honour shaped Germanic society. Ironically, these accounts often served another purpose. Tacitus was not merely describing the Germans, he was quietly criticising Rome. By portraying Germanic tribes as courageous, loyal, and less corrupted by luxury, he encouraged Roman readers to reflect on what they believed their own society had lost. While wealthy Romans competed for political influence and extravagant lifestyles, the so-called barbarians were presented as valuing bravery, honesty, and loyalty above material wealth. On the 30th of November, 1874, a baby boy entered the world in a bedroom at Blenheim Palace, one of the grandest country houses in Britain. The child was named Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, and from the very moment of his birth, expectations surrounded him like the stone walls of the palace itself. He belonged to one of Britain's most distinguished aristocratic families. His grandfather was the Duke of Marlborough, descended from the celebrated military commander John Churchill, whose victories had shaped European history nearly 2 centuries earlier. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising star in British politics, admired for his sharp wit and fiery speeches. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was an American socialite from New York, whose intelligence, charm, and beauty made her one of Victorian London's most talked-about women. It seemed the perfect beginning. It was not. Despite growing up surrounded by wealth, servants, magnificent gardens, and glittering dinner parties, young Winston often lacked the one thing many children need most: time with his parents. Lord Randolph devoted nearly every waking hour to politics. Parliament demanded his attention, political rivals demanded his energy, and public life left little room for family life. Jenny Churchill lived at the centre of fashionable society, attending dinners, charity events, theatre performances, and endless social gatherings that filled London's elite calendar. Their son admired them enormously. He simply saw them very little. Victorian aristocratic families often believed that children should be raised primarily by nurses and governesses rather than by their parents. Winston's childhood followed that tradition almost perfectly. While his mother dazzled guests in elegant ballrooms and his father debated Britain's future in Westminster, Winston spent most of his days in the nursery. Fortunately for him, one person filled that emotional void. Her name was Elizabeth Ann Everest, known affectionately as Womb by the young boy she cared for. She became far more than a nanny. She comforted him when he was frightened, encouraged him when he struggled, celebrated his small victories, and gave him the affection that was often missing elsewhere in his childhood. Years later, Churchill would speak of her with deep gratitude, calling her one of the greatest influences on his early life. Meanwhile, Winston desperately sought his parents' approval. He treasured every letter from his mother and every rare visit from his father. When correspondence arrived, he read it repeatedly. When praise came, it meant everything. Unfortunately, praise was not especially common. Lord Randolph, brilliant but demanding, often viewed his son's academic struggles as signs of laziness rather than potential. His letters could be stern, disappointed, and deeply discouraging. Winston longed to impress the father he admired, yet rarely felt he had succeeded. Ironically, this emotionally distant childhood may have planted one of the defining traits of his entire life. The little boy who struggled to earn attention inside his own family would grow into a man driven by an almost unstoppable desire to prove himself to the entire world. If Winston Churchill had hoped that boarding school would bring him closer to his parents, he was destined for disappointment. At the age of 7, he was sent away from home, following the tradition of many upper-class Victorian families. Aristocratic children were expected to become independent early, and boarding school was considered the proper place to shape character. To modernise, sending a young child away for months at a time might seem unusually harsh. To Victorian Britain, it was simply good parenting. Young Winston was enrolled at St George's School in Ascot. He hated it almost immediately. The school was strict, formal, and unforgiving. Every hour of the day followed a rigid schedule. Lessons began early, discipline was severe, and mistakes were often met with punishment rather than encouragement. Homesickness was treated less as a problem to solve than as a weakness to overcome. For Winston, who already felt emotionally distant from his parents, the experience was deeply lonely. He wrote letters home regularly, especially to his mother, hoping she might visit or bring him home for a few days. Each letter carried a mixture of affection and longing. Sometimes replies arrived. Often they did not arrive as quickly as he wished. The silence hurt almost as much as the separation itself. School offered little comfort. Churchill struggled with subjects that required endless memorization of Latin grammar and mathematical formulas. His reports frequently described him as inattentive, careless, or difficult. Teachers complained that he seemed unwilling to follow instructions and often drifted into his own thoughts instead of concentrating on the lesson before him. They were not entirely wrong. Winston possessed an energetic imagination that rarely stayed confined inside the classroom. Unfortunately, Victorian education rewarded obedience far more than curiosity. Discipline at St George's could also be physically harsh. Churchill later recalled being punished with regular beatings, a common practice in 19th century British schools. Whether every memory reflected daily reality or was sharpened by childhood emotion is difficult to determine, but there is little doubt that he dreaded many days there. Eventually, concerns about the school's management and Winston's health led his parents to transfer him to Brunswick School in Hove. The change proved significant. Although still a boarding school with firm discipline, Brunswick offered a kinder atmosphere. Winston's health improved, and for the first time, some teachers began noticing that beneath his rebellious nature lay genuine ability. He remained an inconsistent student. Latin continued to feel like an elaborate conspiracy against children. Mathematics rarely inspired affection, and neat handwriting seemed determined never to become one of his talents. Yet something unexpected began to emerge. He developed a love for English. Poetry fascinated him. Historical stories captured his imagination. He displayed an astonishing ability to memorize long passages of literature and recite them almost perfectly. While classmates struggled through a few lines, Winston could recall entire poems with remarkable accuracy. The lonely boy who often disappointed his teachers was quietly discovering the greatest weapon he would ever possess. Not a rifle, not a sword, but words. By the time Winston Churchill settled into his new school, one thing had become abundantly clear. He was never going to be the easiest pupil in the classroom. Teachers often described him as careless, untidy, argumentative, and stubborn. He had an unfortunate habit of questioning instructions instead of simply following them. If he believed a rule made little sense, he was perfectly willing to ignore it, regardless of the consequences. Victorian schools, unsurprisingly, were not especially enthusiastic about this approach. Education during the late 19th century prized discipline above almost everything else. boys were expected to sit quietly, memorize lessons, obey without hesitation, and show proper respect to every master. Winston managed some of these expectations occasionally. All of them at once proved considerably more difficult. He disliked learning purely for the sake of examinations. Endless drills in Latin grammar bored him beyond measure. Mathematics seemed determined to wage a personal campaign against him. The more someone insisted that a subject was important simply because it was traditional, the less interested Winston became. This frustrated his teachers enormously. Many concluded that he lacked ability. In reality, the opposite was often true. Churchill possessed a restless mind that learned differently. When something genuinely captured his attention, his concentration became extraordinary. He could spend hours reading military adventures, historical biographies, or accounts of great battles. Stories of Julius Caesar, the Duke of Marlborough, and Napoleon fascinated him far more than verb conjugations ever could. His memory also continued to impress those who looked beyond his report cards. Long poems, speeches and passages from English literature stayed in his mind with remarkable ease. He enjoyed reciting them dramatically, discovering that carefully chosen words possessed an almost magical power over an audience. Without realizing it, he was already practicing skills that would one day echo across Parliament and wartime radio broadcasts. Outside the classroom, Winston remained energetic to the point of exhaustion. He climbed trees, explored every corner of school grounds, invented imaginary military campaigns, and occasionally found himself in trouble, simply because curiosity had carried him somewhere he was not supposed to be. Adults often mistook this endless energy for laziness or defiance. It was neither. It was ambition searching for direction. His father, unfortunately, saw little reason for optimism. Lord Randolph continued receiving disappointing school reports describing poor grades and inconsistent effort. He increasingly feared that his son would never achieve much in life. For Winston, these judgments cut deeply. He admired his father almost to the point of hero worship. Every criticism felt devastating, because it came from the one man whose approval he wanted most. Yet instead of giving up, those disappointments slowly produced something unexpected. They awakened a quiet determination. If no one believed in his abilities, he would simply have to prove them wrong. The rebellious schoolboy who refused to fit neatly inside Victorian expectations was not failing because he lacked intelligence. He was struggling because the path laid before him was never going to be the one he ultimately followed. In 1888, Winston Churchill entered Harrow School, one of Britain's most prestigious public schools. His father had hoped for something quite different. Winston had first attempted the entrance examination for Eton, the school that educated generations of Britain's elite. But that plan never materialised. Harrow became his destination instead. At first, it hardly looked like the beginning of greatness. Churchill arrived with academic records that were, to put it politely, unremarkable. Because his knowledge of Latin was weak, he was placed in one of the lower forms. For a boy born into one of Britain's most distinguished families, it was an embarrassing start. Some classmates undoubtedly expected very little from him. Many teachers did as well. Yet Harrow turned out to be the first place where Winston's unusual strengths began to outweigh his weaknesses. One fortunate decision changed everything. Instead of forcing him through advanced classical studies that had caused him endless frustration, Harrow allowed Churchill to focus more heavily on English. It was a subject that demanded imagination rather than memorizing endless grammatical rules, and Winston flourished almost immediately. He immersed himself in literature. He memorized long passages from Shakespeare and Macaulay with astonishing ease. He read poetry aloud until the rhythm and cadence became second nature. Historical narratives fascinated him, not simply because of the events themselves, but because of how great writers brought those events to life through carefully chosen words. Without realizing it, he was giving himself an education far more valuable than any examination could measure. Churchill also developed an appreciation for rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking. He became fascinated by how a well-constructed sentence could inspire courage, change opinions, or command attention. While many boys dreaded standing before the class, Winston slowly discovered that he enjoyed it. Speaking offered something that written examinations never had: an audience. Years later, listeners would marvel at his speeches during Britain's darkest hours, believing his talent had appeared almost overnight. In reality, its foundations were being laid inside Harrow's classrooms decades earlier. His academic record remained mixed. Mathematics still refused to become a close friend. Science interested him only occasionally. Latin continued its long campaign of mutual disappointment. His school reports rarely suggested that Britain was educating a future prime minister. But those reports overlooked qualities that were far harder to grade. Churchill possessed relentless curiosity. He asked questions others ignored. He read beyond the assigned lessons. When a subject captured his imagination, he pursued it with remarkable energy. Outside the classroom, he became increasingly interested in military history. Maps, famous campaigns, biographies of great commanders, and stories of daring victories filled his spare time. His ancestor, John Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough, remained one of his greatest heroes, and Winston studied his campaigns with genuine admiration. By the time he left Harrow, Winston Churchill was still far from being considered an exceptional student. But something far more important had begun to emerge. For the first time, he had discovered not just what he struggled to learn. He had discovered what he was born to do. As Winston Churchill approached the end of his time at Harrow, one uncomfortable reality became increasingly difficult to ignore. His academic record was simply not strong enough for many of the prestigious careers expected of young aristocrats. Oxford or Cambridge seemed unlikely. His father had already begun lowering his expectations, concluding that Winston probably lacked the discipline for a distinguished political or legal career. Instead, Lord Randolph decided that the army might suit his energetic, adventurous son far better. There was just one problem. Even becoming an officer required passing a demanding entrance examination. Churchill applied to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, Britain's premier training academy for army officers. The examination tested mathematics, English, Latin, French, and several other subjects. Unfortunately, it included many of the very topics Winston had spent years unsuccessfully trying to master. His first attempt ended in failure. For many young men, one unsuccessful examination would have been deeply discouraging. For Winston, it became something else entirely, a challenge. He hired a private tutor, Captain Walter James, who immediately recognised that Churchill did not respond well to traditional methods. Instead of overwhelming him with endless lectures, James focused on practical coaching, concentrating on exactly what Winston needed to pass the examination. Progress came slowly. Churchill worked harder than he ever had before, yet when he sat the examination a second time, disappointment arrived once again. He failed. By now, critics had plenty of evidence to support their opinions. Teachers who had always considered him average felt justified. His father grew increasingly frustrated, believing Winston simply lacked the determination necessary for serious achievement. Every unsuccessful examination appeared to confirm the same painful conclusion. Yet Winston refused to abandon the goal. Failure irritated him far more than it defeated him. He continued studying, continued practicing, and continued preparing for another opportunity. Looking back, it is remarkable how often this pattern would repeat throughout his life. Setbacks rarely caused Churchill to retreat. More often, they convinced him to push even harder. On his third attempt, the breakthrough finally came. He passed the entrance examination. Better still, he qualified for the cavalry rather than the infantry. At first glance, this may have seemed a fortunate outcome. Cavalry officers enjoyed a certain prestige and excitement, serving on horseback in some of the army's most glamorous regiments. There was, however, a practical reason as well. The cavalry required lower mathematics scores than the infantry. Churchill himself later admitted this with characteristic honesty and humour. Mathematics had not suddenly surrendered. He had simply found a route around it. For Winston, passing the examination represented far more than admission to Sandhurst. It was proof. Proof that persistence could overcome disappointment. Proof that early failures did not determine the rest of a person's life. The boy whose teachers had so often underestimated him had finally earned his place. Now, for the first time, he was entering an environment where courage, determination and ambition mattered just as much as perfect school reports. And that was a world in which Winston Churchill was finally beginning to thrive. Walking through the gates of the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, Winston Churchill entered a world that suited him far better than any classroom he had known before. For years, teachers had judged him by his ability to translate Latin or solve mathematical equations. At Sandhurst, those skills still mattered, but they no longer defined success. Here, leadership, initiative, physical endurance and quick decision-making carried equal weight. For perhaps the first time in his life, Winston felt that he belonged. The academy's daily routine was demanding from the very beginning. Cadets rose early, drilled for hours, studied military tactics, practiced riding, learned map reading, and trained with weapons. Every movement demanded discipline. Every mistake was noticed. Every exercise prepared future officers for the possibility that one day real lives would depend on their decisions. Unlike his earlier schools, however, Sandhurst connected learning directly to action. Churchill found that immensely satisfying. He particularly excelled in cavalry training. Riding had fascinated him since childhood, and now he spent countless hours mastering horsemanship. A cavalry officer needed complete confidence in the saddle, capable of controlling both horse and weapon across difficult terrain. It was physically exhausting. It was also exactly the kind of challenge Winston enjoyed. Military history became another favourite subject. Rather than memorising abstract facts, cadets analysed famous battles, examined the decisions of successful commanders, and discussed why campaigns succeeded or failed. Churchill approached these lessons with enormous enthusiasm. He was no longer studying history simply because it appeared in a textbook. He was studying it because one day he hoped to make history himself. Even his instructors noticed the difference. Churchill remained energetic, outspoken, and occasionally impulsive, but his determination was impossible to ignore. The young man who had struggled to remain interested in ordinary classrooms now attacked military training with genuine commitment. Not everything came easily. Sword drill demanded precision. Endless inspections required attention to detail, something Winston had never naturally possessed. Uniforms had to be spotless, equipment perfectly maintained, and every button correctly fastened. Carelessness invited immediate criticism. Some habits, it seemed, survived even the finest military education, yet Churchill steadily improved. When he graduated in 1894, he ranked 20th in a class of 130 cadets. It was a respectable result, especially considering the academic disappointments that had filled much of his earlier education. More importantly, Sandhurst transformed his confidence. For years, Winston had been the disappointing schoolboy whom teachers underestimated and whose father frequently criticized. Now he had proven to himself as much as anyone else that he could succeed in a demanding institution through hard work and persistence. The academy also strengthened qualities that would define him throughout his life: resilience under pressure, fascination with military affairs, confidence in his own judgment, and an unwavering belief that obstacles existed to be overcome rather than accepted. Looking back, Sandhurst gave Churchill far more than a commission as an army officer. It gave him the first genuine taste of success. And after years spent searching for it, that success convinced him that far greater achievements might finally lie within reach. When Winston Churchill graduated from Sandhurst in 1894, he had finally become what his father believed he never quite would: a commissioned officer in the British Army. For many young officers, that achievement alone would have been enough. They accepted their commissions, joined their regiments, and settled into the predictable rhythm of military life. Winston had entirely different plans. He did not simply want to serve in the army. He wanted adventure. The late 19th century was the height of the British Empire. Across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, British soldiers found themselves involved in campaigns, colonial expeditions, and frontier conflicts. While many officers quietly hoped to avoid danger, Churchill actively searched for it. Peace, in his opinion, was frustrating. War offered opportunity. His first taste of military life came with the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, a cavalry regiment known for its proud traditions. Yet Winston quickly realised that life in a peacetime regiment could be surprisingly uneventful. There were inspections, drills, riding exercises, and endless routines, but very little action. He grew restless. Rather than waiting patiently for history to find him, Churchill decided to chase history himself. An opportunity soon appeared in Cuba. At the time, Cuban rebels were fighting for independence from Spanish rule, and although Britain was not involved in the conflict, Churchill secured permission to travel there as both a military observer and a newspaper correspondent. It was an unusual arrangement. By day, he observed military operations alongside Spanish forces. By night, he wrote newspaper articles describing everything he had seen. Most young officers earned only their military salary. Churchill intended to earn a reputation as well. His reports revealed an important truth about his character. He possessed an extraordinary ability to transform personal experience into compelling stories. Battles fascinated him not only because he enjoyed military affairs, but because he instinctively understood how to describe them. Every campaign became both an education and material for publication. It was the beginning of a lifelong habit. Throughout his career, Churchill would repeatedly combine soldiering, journalism, and politics in ways that few others ever attempted. The Cuban expedition also introduced him to several habits that remained with him for decades.